7 men. A private island. No last names. 1910. The week they spent there wrote the architecture of every dollar in our pockets. And right now, the same architecture is being rewritten in Basel. The country had run 137 years without a central bank. The New York Clearinghouse moved money between banks during panics. Economist Elmas Wicker calls it a quasi-central bank that already worked. So the question after the panic of 1907 wasn't whether banks could survive without a Fed. It was who would own the lender of last resort. November 1910, 6 bankers and Senator Nelson Aldrich slipped onto a private train car for Jekyll Island, Georgia. They used only first names. One of them, Frank Vanderlip, later confessed in print in the 1935 Saturday Evening Post. I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. Paul Warburg published his own book on the meeting in 1930. The architecture they drafted that week became the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., reading the bill on the House floor, called it the most gigantic trust on earth. The day of reckoning is only a few years removed. A year earlier, the Pujo Committee had documented 341 interlocking directorships in 112 corporations worth $22 billion. Henry Ford opposed it. Railroad Baron James J. Hill opposed it. The bill passed anyway. The popular version of this story adds one more beat, that John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus opposed the Fed and died on the Titanic in April 1912 to clear the path. The archive disagrees. The New York Times of October 16, 1911 records Straus publicly urging colleagues to act at once to create a Federal Reserve. Astor reportedly favored it. The Mersey inquiry attributed the sinking to excessive speed through a known ice field. The Fed passed. Not for that reason. But here's what's wild. Once a printing press is wired to a treasury, wars become affordable. And the question that haunts the next 30 years is this: did the same banks finance both sides? In World War I, J.P. Morgan and Company became the official purchasing agent for the Entente, $10.3 billion in loans, more than half of all Allied shell casings, 2/3 of their grain imports. Adam Tooze, Columbia historian, documents the lot. Meanwhile, Paul Warburg's brother Max ran M.M. Warburg in Hamburg and served as the Kaiser's financial advisor. Same family. 2 armies. America entered the war a debtor, it exited a creditor, and the dollar began its march to reserve status. World War II is messier. Tooze's later work shows the Reich was overwhelmingly self-financed through plunder and MIFO bills. The Wall Street funded Hitler symmetry oversells. But documents do exist. In October 1942, the U.S. government seized Union Banking Corporation under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Its director, Prescott Bush, father of one president, grandfather of another. IBM's German subsidiary Dahomag kept Hollerith punch card machines running through the camps. The Bank for International Settlements itself kept clearing payments through the war. The financing wasn't symmetrical. The connections weren't innocent. 1944, at a New Hampshire hotel called Bretton Woods, 44 nations pinned every currency to the dollar and the dollar to gold. It held for 27 years. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon went on television and said, "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." The word temporarily has now lasted 55 years. 3 years later, Treasury Secretary William Simon flew quietly to Riyadh. Princeton political scientist David Spiro's archival work makes the deal explicit. The United States and Saudi Arabia agreed, in secret, that oil would be priced in dollars and the proceeds recycled into U.S. Treasury debt. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, it was backed by oil. The long arc isn't really about families. Edmund de Rothschild today manages 184 billion Swiss francs. Rockefeller Capital, $191 billion. Real money, not the world. The story is the architecture those families helped build, and the upgrade being installed right now. Basel, April 2024. The Bank for International Settlements launched Project Agorá. 7 central banks: the New York Fed, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Korea, Banco de Mexico, the Swiss National Bank, plus 41 private banks, are building what BIS calls, verbatim, a public-private programmable core financial platform, a tokenized unified ledger. The testing phase report lands in the first half of 2026. That's the wholesale layer. The retail layer arrives in two parts. First, stablecoins, privately issued, KYC gated, given a legal home by the 2025 Genius Act. Second, digital identity wallets, rolling out across the European Union, the United Kingdom, and India this decade. Together they make money that can be routed, restricted, or revoked at the protocol layer. And Project M-Bridge, the Chinese-led parallel rail, has already cleared more than $55 billion in cross-border settlement, 95% of it in ECNY. Jerome Powell has said no to a retail CBDC for as long as he leads the Fed, but Oxford's Capital Markets Law Journal flagged the deeper risk in writing. Smart contracts that restrict CBDC use for antisocial habits represent an extreme form of state paternalism. The architecture decides what the architecture allows. 7 men wrote the last version on an island. The next version is being written in a working group. Next time, we trace what actually lives behind a wallet that can say no